I'm always on the lookout for a good violin story, and I was down in London for the Logico-Philosophicus concert when I came across this one about a Nazi era Strad. Those are the stories that in particular interest me. And they just remind you that these Strads often come with a very rich history. People don't really own them, they're just custodians of them. Hopefully they survive wars, bombing raids and other unfortunate events that engulf them, and live to see another day, and are passed on to other owners afterwards and ultimately end up in the hands of a fine modern player, or perhaps in a museum where a lot of these Strads now probably belong. At the end of the day, they're getting very old, and some of them quite bashed up after years, literally centuries of usage. But it's these stories that kind of breathe life into these instruments and make them so intriguing and precious as well. They add to the value of the instrument, the provenance, the name of the instrument and whose hands it's passed through. So in other words, although they are just delicate pieces of wood, their histories can make them almost appear like living things. The story reminds me of another Strad, or another set of instruments, the Baron von Rothschild instruments, and their story during the Nazi time. But here is yet another Jewish Baron Stradivarius story from the Nazi times. It shows just how highly valued these instruments were even in the 30s, and just how valuable they were and how coveted they were by the evil Nazis as well. So there are a few interesting threads to pursue from this story. We're going to concentrate on one main Stradivarius, but there'll be some other instruments in the mix as well, all related to this same family, well-to-do elite, you could say, Austrian Jewish family from that time. So the Stradivarius in question is the 1716 Baron Wittgenstein Stradivarius. 1716 means that we're in the golden period of Strad's violin making. Therefore, these are probably the most highly sought after of the Stradivaris, the best sounding and the best made ones from the golden period, which was from roughly 1700 to 1725, thereabouts. So 1700 when Strad was 56, up until 1725 when he was 81. So those are the very finest Strads. Of course, Stradivari continued to make fine Strads right up to his death when he was in his 90s. But all of them are great, and the early ones are great too, but this is really the golden period. So starting off the story with the Baron Karl Wittgenstein. He's not alive when the Nazis come around, so the pain is kind of experienced by his descendants. But he's the guy who first brings this violin into his family alongside some other violins, such as the Soldat Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù of 1742, which we're going to come on to discuss as well. So Karl Wittgenstein owned this particular violin, named after him, the Baron Wittgenstein Stradivari of 1716. He owned it up until 1913. And when did he actually get hold of the Strad? According to Tricia, around 1890, so therefore he had this instrument for about 23 years up until his death, and after which it passed on to his descendant, his son Paul Wittgenstein, who we're also going to talk about. He was a concert pianist. But let's start off with Karl first. So Karl Wittgenstein was an industrialist tycoon, judging by the photos quite a handsome chap as well. He was a friend of Andrew Carnegie, so that gives you an idea of the kind of elite circles he moved in. And he controlled a monopoly on steel and iron in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And by the 1890s had become one of the richest men in the world. That's when he began to invest in fine instruments, it seems. Obtained the Strad in 1890. He was the father of concert pianist Paul Wittgenstein and the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and also the philanthropist Margaret Stonborough Wittgenstein. Now, Karl Wittgenstein was born into a bourgeois Jewish family, but you could say he was a bit of a rebel. He ran away from home, lived for a while as a saloon musician, so he was actually musically inclined, and a bit of a rebel. After a year of education and an apprenticeship, Karl took the job of a draftsman on the construction of a rolling mill in Bohemia, a post offered to him by Paul Kupelwieser, the brother of his brother-in-law. Karl rapidly rose through the company, taking over Kupelwieser as managing director within 5 years. By the end of the 19th century, Karl Wittgenstein was one of the wealthiest men in Europe and a leading figure in the iron and steel industry. In 1898, he retired from his posts and transferred much of his wealth to foreign equities, principally in the United States, which protected the Wittgenstein family from the inflation in Vienna after the First World War. He had already passed off the scene by then, because he was born in 1847 and he died in 1913. Karl married Leopoldine Maria Josepha Kalmus, known among friends as Poldi, in 1873. She was the only spouse of any of Hermann Christian's children, that's the ancestor of Karl, who had a Jewish background. So all the rest of them married non-Jews, it seems. Her father was a Bohemian Jew and her mother was an Austrian Slovene Catholic. They had the following children, quite a lot of children: Hermine, Dora, Johannes, Conrad, Helena, Rudolf, Margaret, Ludwig, and Paul is the one, the concert pianist, that we're going to be particularly interested in a moment, because he inherits the Strad. In those days, rich people were sensible and they invested in Italian antique instruments. Karl, being a musician as well, had an added interest to do that. And what a lucky man he was, coming into possession of a fine golden period Stradivari. Paul did not inherit the Del Gesù, so let's move on to Paul now as historical owner. But he did come into possession of a Guadagnini, a 1770 Guadagnini, the Wittgenstein, and the Wittgenstein viola of 1620, which is an Antonio and Girolamo Amati. Paul came into possession of the Strad in 1913. It was bequeathed to him, obviously, by his father, and he owned it until 1950, so through the Nazi era and beyond, slightly beyond. So let's come on to Paul then. Paul Wittgenstein, son of Karl Wittgenstein, obviously born into a super rich family, was born in 1887 and died in 1961. He was an Austrian-American concert pianist, notable for commissioning new piano concerti for the left hand alone, after his right arm was amputated during World War I. So obviously a hero of the war, a veteran of World War I. Interestingly, his high birth did not shield him from that. He devised novel techniques, including pedal and hand movement combinations, that allowed him to play chords previously thought impossible for a five-fingered pianist. Paul Wittgenstein was born in Vienna, the fourth son and seventh of the 8 children, excluding a daughter who died at birth, of industrialist Karl Wittgenstein and Leopoldine Maria Josepha Kalmus. He was raised as a Catholic, as 3 of his grandparents had converted to Christianity. Only his paternal grandmother had no Jewish lineage, so the others were all Jews who converted, but his paternal grandmother was Aryan. What about the musical links that this family had? The household, being an eminent family, was frequently visited by prominent cultural figures. Check out some of the names. Among them, the composers Johannes Brahms, Gustav Mahler, Joseph Labor, and Richard Strauss, with whom the young Paul played duets. His grandmother, Fanny Wittgenstein, was a first cousin of the violinist Joseph Joachim, whom she adopted, and I spoke about her in my video about Joachim. She took him to Leipzig to study with Felix Mendelssohn. Paul Wittgenstein studied with Malvin Bray and later with the Polish virtuoso Theodor Leschetizky. He made his public debut in 1913, attracting favourable reviews. The next year, World War I broke out and he was called up for military service. Perhaps he was an officer. He was shot in the elbow and captured by the Russians during the Battle of Galicia, and his right arm had to be amputated. During his recovery in a prisoner of war camp in Omsk in Siberia, Wittgenstein resolved to continue his career using only his left hand. Through the Danish ambassador, he wrote to his old teacher Joseph Labor, who was blind, asking for a concerto for the left hand. Labor responded quickly, saying he had already started work on a piece. After the war, Wittgenstein studied intensely, arranging pieces for the left hand alone and learning Labor's new composition. He began to perform again. Many reviews were qualified with comments that he played very well for a man with one arm, but he persevered. He then approached famous composers asking them to write material for him to perform. Benjamin Britten, Paul Hindemith, Alexander Tansman, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, Sergei Prokofiev, Karl Weigel, Franz Schmidt, Sergei Bortkiewicz and Richard Strauss all produced pieces for him. Maurice Ravel wrote his piano concerto for the left hand, which became more famous than any of the other compositions Wittgenstein inspired. But when Wittgenstein made changes to the score for the premiere, Ravel was incensed, and the two never reconciled. So he had a tendency to mess about with the compositions that were dedicated to him, and Ravel did not like that, apparently. So now we come on to the Nazi time, when Germany, that great bastion of culture, the place where German Romanticism took shape, and I've picked up this book at second-hand bookstore that I'm going to read all about it. The likes of Liszt, Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms and Mendelssohn, all these people, the Nazis came along and subverted the culture, decimated it by removing the Jews out of public life, and then just proceeded to destroy Germany completely. So what was life like for Jews who had money? They obviously had an advantage over those that didn't. So even though this Wittgenstein family were Christians, this did not protect them. The family under the Nuremberg laws were classed as Jews. And after the 1938 Anschluss, then Hitler took over Austria where they lived, and they were trapped. Paul tried to persuade his sisters Hermine and Helena, aged 69 and 64 at the time, to leave Vienna, but they demurred. They were attached to their homes there and could not believe that such a distinguished family as theirs was in real danger. Ironically, being steel tycoons, this family must have contributed to the Austro-Hungarian war effort during World War I, surely. Ludwig had already been living in England for some years, and Margaret Gretel was married to an American. Paul, who was no longer permitted to perform in public under the Nazis, moved to the US, so he got out early. In 1938, from there, he and Gretel, with some assistance from Ludwig, who acquired British nationality in 1939, managed to use family finances, mostly held abroad, legal connections, to attain non-Jewish status for their sisters. This is very interesting. Hitler would, on rare occasions, Aryanize Jews that he liked. Some examples would be Emil Morris, his chauffeur, and also a very top brass German airfield marshal, Milch, who was in the Luftwaffe, and some say was a full-blooded Jew who was Aryanized by Hitler and Goering. You can look into this more if it interests you in the book Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. So in other words, Paul and his sister arranged to pay the Nazis large sums of money to Aryanize his sisters, or have them declared as Mischlings at least. The family's financial portfolio consisted of properties and other assets in Germany and occupied lands with a total value of about 6 billion. Can you imagine? Possibly the largest private fortune in Europe. Essentially, all the family assets were surrendered to the Nazis in return for protection afforded to the two sisters under exceptional interpretations of racial laws, allowing them to continue to live in their family palace in Vienna. Now, if you look at the book Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, you see that often Hitler, who did delegate a lot of matters to competing Nazis underneath him, there was a lot of infighting. And he did that deliberately to sow discord, to keep everyone under control. With this topic of deciding who is a good Jew and not, Virtually no one could make that decision without Hitler. These cases would land directly on his desk. Do look into the Baron von Rothschild, Nathan Rothschild, the Baron from Vienna, who also found himself trapped, because that's also a fascinating story. Even Himmler turned up at his house, and how that progressed, how the Nazis, how he bribed his way out, is also another interesting story. But it seems like the Nazis honoured their word, and in return for this vast wealth, they allowed these Jewish women to continue to live in relative safety in Vienna in their palace. So Paul was in America now. What was his life like in America? Paul Wittgenstein's wife Hilda had been his pupil. They had 2 children before their marriage, the first conceived after the first piano lesson, when Hilda was 18 and Paul 47. Because Hilda was not Jewish, Paul was open to charges of racial defilement. In 1938, he fled to New York. In 1940, he spent 7 months in Cuba attempting to secure permanent visas for Hilda and himself, and they married in a Catholic ceremony in Havana on the 20th of August 1940. When his wife and children arrived in the US in 1941, he set them up in a house on Long Island, which he visited at weekends from his apartment on Riverside Drive. Wittgenstein became a US citizen in 1946 and spent the rest of his life in the US, where he did much teaching as well as playing. He died in New York City in 1961 and was buried on Long Island, but later disinterred and reburied in Pine Grove Cemetery, South Sterling, Pike County, Pennsylvania, where his widow had moved. Paul was an art collector and also had works by Gustav Klimt. Let's get back to this Stradivarius then. A review of the book The House of Wittgenstein, A Family at War by Alexander Waugh. In September 1938, Paul managed to flee surreptitiously to Zurich, where the family had been able to transfer much of its fortune into a Swiss trust. There he was also able to arrange for valuable musical instruments, including a Stradivari violin and a Ruggieri cello, to be smuggled to him. Bitter negotiations took place among the siblings, both in Zurich and in New York, as the Germans attempted to force them to turn over the family assets in return for granting Mischling half-breed status to Hermine and Helena, who remained stuck in Vienna. So it's almost like the Nazis were treating them like kidnapped women, but they would have been very much in danger. So at least they weren't abandoned by their siblings. And like I said, Hitler would always deal with these kind of cases personally. And so finally, in August 1939, Hitler personally signed the order granting the Wittgensteins Mischling status in exchange for the bulk of the family fortune, estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of US dollars. Paul was allowed to keep 2.3 million Swiss francs, roughly 9 million in US dollars as of the year 2000 when this article was written. Gretel was forced to emigrate to New York. Meanwhile, Hitler's 4-year plan, an expensive program of national reconstruction and rearmament, made him thirsty for revenue, and in April 1938 he issued a decree that required all citizens of whatever racial origin to declare foreign assets. The form that was sent out to the Jewish population at the beginning of May was an extended version of that which went to the Aryan population and demanded that every Jew provide details of his or her assets, including those held within the Reich, pictures, plates, bank credit, buildings, business, photographs, and so on. This is where Nazism and communism kind of merge, isn't it? Both kind of the same thing in some ways. After what's called National Socialism, seizing people's assets, but especially the Jews. Paul's declaration claims an income of 57,700 Reichsmarks in the year April 1938, and assets of 4.3 million Reichsmarks. The form makes interesting reading as it offers a glimpse into his private financial affairs. Among his possessions were to be found a Stradivari violin of 1716, valued at 30,000 Reichsmarks. That's a lot of money, isn't it, for the time? and a viola by Antonius and Hieronymus Amati at 10,000 Reichsmarks. From Philips Musical Instruments Auction Catalogue, November the 8th, 1984. Getting all this information from Tarisio, by the way. I'll leave the links in the description. With the connivance of Dr. Heinz Fischer, a Swiss concert promoter, a German string quartet was invited to play in Zurich, bringing Paul's precious instruments from Vienna, 2 violins, one by Stradivari, one by Guadagnini, a viola by Amati and a Ruggieri cello. Nobody would notice as they crossed the border at Haslach that the instruments in the cases were not theirs. Nor would they spot when the musicians returned to the Reich with cheaper models under their arms than those with which they had left. A clever smuggling act. Dr. Fischer's and the musicians' payment for this risky undertaking is not known. Nor is the fate of the 2 violins. Perhaps the instruments were themselves the smuggler's reward, but in October 1938, Paul took the viola and the cello to the Swiss violin maker Stübiger, who valued them at 18,000 Swiss francs each. A quick sale brought him temporary financial relief. That's from the house of Wittgenstein, a family at war, Alexander War, London. During the war, Wittgenstein was not permitted to export his Stradivari and Guadagnini violins, nor a large collection of valuable musical manuscripts and other musical objects. Okay, so that smuggling out of instruments did not include the Strad. After the war, he negotiated for the export of his 1716 Antonio Stradivari and 1776 Johannes Baptista Guadagnini violins. Now, I've done another video on how the Nazis hoarded all these instruments from all over Europe and put them in this massive warehouse. Some of the fine instruments were lost, still haven't been recovered, but many of them were seized by the Allies, and some of them ultimately went back to their rightful owners after the war. In this case, I don't know whether the Strad and the Guadagnini, whether they stayed put in Austria. Were they with the sisters in the palace in Vienna? I'm not too clear on that. On August 30th, 1950, Otto Demos, president of the BDA, permitted the export of Wittgenstein, Stradivari and Guadagnini violins, but in exchange for a donation of artwork to the Austrian National Gallery. So again, blackmailing this family even after the war. Wittgenstein imported these 2 violins into the US and consigned them for sale through New York violin dealer Emil Hermann in 1950. Now, Emil Hermann was the guy who sold the David del Gesù to Jascha Heifetz's father in the 20s. So he was a German violin dealer who shifted to America, I think definitely German Jewish. And so, yeah, when Paul retrieved the Strad, he more or less straight away arranged for it to be sold. And that's how it passed on to others. The instruments that were smuggled, the Ruggieri cello, and then interesting, another Strad, but certainly the viola and the cello that were smuggled out, they brought Paul immediate financial relief in October 1938 when he sold them in Switzerland. But they're also said that he was permitted to keep a couple of million of Swiss francs. So there's different accounts of this event, of what took place here going on. So let's look at a little bit then of the provenance of the Strad. So from Stübiger to Emil Hermann, but in between with Carl Wittgenstein and Paul Wittgenstein, and then John Corigliano, and then the state from 1976, the state of Bulgaria obtained the Strad, where it still is, I believe, and it's played by has been played by violinist Minchko Minchev. Moving on to the Del Gesù, this one Paul did not inherit. It went from Baron Karl to the Wittgenstein family, and then on to Steffi Geyer, Hans Sauser, Frau Zaki Metzler, and then sold by Pierre Gerbet and Jacques Francais, and now in 2002 it's with the current owner, has been played by Rachel Barton Pine. And this Del Gesù was actually played by Antonio Bazzini, so a famous violin provenance there going on. You could say this violin is a casualty of the war, said Gerhard Eisenberger, an heir of the Wittgenstein family, speaking in his Vienna home. Survivors of the Wittgenstein family do not know how the family lost possession of its 1742 Guarnerius del Gesù instrument, or whether the violin was part of negotiations with the Nazis. The family has never filed a claim for the instrument, and it's possible the Wittgensteins maintained possession of the instrument and sold it themselves. The Del Gesù ended up in Paris in the violin shop of Émile Francais, and then upon his death in the 70s, his unsold instruments were divided between his two sons, one of which was the noted New York violin dealer Jacques Francais. But Jacques Francais will not acknowledge owning the instrument for the past several decades, nor will he say where or from whom his father acquired it. It's called the Soldat, but they should have called it the Bazzini, really, because this is how some of the violin dealers referred to it. Interestingly, Joseph Joachim was a first cousin of Carl's, and it seems like he had the opportunity to play on this Del Gesù, which was generously loaned to him by Carl. Now we come on to the 1770 Guadagnini, GB Guadagnini. Some say is the number 3 violin maker after Strad and Del Gesù. This was the one that was smuggled by the quartet, by the players into Switzerland. And provenance there only goes back as far as Paul in 1938. So perhaps he inherited this from Carl, I don't know. And then it was sold in 1955. It had already been in Switzerland, so trail goes quite a bit between those years. But it's still, as of 2003, still around. And now the Antonio and Girolamo Amati of 1620, the Wittgenstein, appears to be the other instrument that was smuggled out into Switzerland in 1938. This passed on to Johann Stübiger in 1938, and then ultimately on to Emil Herrmann in America. And one of the violins owned by Dr. Herbert Axelrod, who wrote this book. I've actually done a separate video on Axelrod, a massive Heifetz fan and massive major collector of fine instruments as well, and looks like this was one of the ones that he donated to the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. So that's the story of that Strad. By turning over to the Nazis the Wittgenstein fortune which Carl Wittgenstein had invested in the United States, as well as some musical instruments and manuscripts, their classification as Jews was modified to allow them to remain safely in Vienna, the two sisters. So at least he valued the life of his sisters more than any instruments or musical manuscripts. So these stories are quite sad, quite tragic, nostalgic, but at least for the Jews who were fortunate enough to have money, they had leverage, they could maneuver things in order to at least be able to survive, and in some cases keep hold of or recover their instruments. Like I said, these Strads have incredible histories attached to them in all cases, but some more than others, particularly the ones that made it through this Nazi era, this stain on human history, and managed to survive that time, and are still around today, either being played or perhaps in museums being kept safe. And I almost forgot, there is one final Stradivarius to mention, the 1727 Kreutzer Stradivarius, that came into possession of the Wittgenstein family around 1910. And is now owned by Maxim Vengerov.